Tracy and Rob, you presented to the conference the results of some research you've been doing about the reality of intergenerational poverty. What were the main findings?
Well, what we were interested in researching was this very popular idea that you hear it said by politicians, policymakers, that there are 3 generations of families where nobody has ever worked. It's a very widespread idea that people believe in. So we wanted to just ask the first point is see, is that true? And if it is true, how many families fall into that position? So we did research in Glasgow and in Middlesbrough, used different sorts of methods and different sorts of techniques to try to find families where there were, across 3 generations, a situation where nobody had ever worked. The short answer is we couldn't find anybody. We couldn't locate any such family, and other research published around the same time confirmed, in terms of social statistics, how small, an infinitesimally small group that would be if they exist at all.
So what sort of families were you looking at then, if it wasn't 3 generational?
I think because of the nature of this research project, we were looking for families that are highly unusual. So we know from the statistics that there are not many families that out there that have never worked. So because of the nature of the research, we were really drilling down to very unusual families. So the families we spoke to in the end were ones which faced a range of very difficult and serious issues in respect of their lives. So all sorts of things relating to poor educational experiences, but also sometimes drug and alcohol use. So these are unusual families, not typical experiences of worklessness at all.
These are sometimes called troubled families or problem families. There's a long history of naming families like this under different sorts of rubrics. But certainly in terms of the Westminster government, the idea of troubled families is strong on the policy agenda at the moment. So as part of our research, we interviewed and talked to these families to try to understand from them what their experiences were, because one of our positions is there's a lot said about people who are in poverty, or there's a lot said about troubled families, but there's rather less of actually talking to and talking with troubled families to try to understand their experiences a little bit more directly.
And what came out of that?
I think we find that when we're talking to families about employment, because of the complex range of difficulties that people were facing, it was often seen to us to be obscene to be asking why the person might not have a job, because it was patently obvious to us in talking to families and learning about the range of problems they had that it was often virtually impossible for somebody to have a job. Now, that's not to say that our interviewees weren't keen to work and didn't value work and didn't recognise very well the value of having a job because they did.
Can I just add one thing to that? One of the differences between what we might say about inverted commas troubled families and some of the government discourses and reports about it is that an overriding experience for these families was one of poverty, which is too little recognised officially in government rhetorics and government documents. So if you're living in poor circumstances, you're struggling with poverty, and a problem comes along and bangs into you, then another one bangs into you, and then another one, it's much harder to deal with those sorts of problems than if you're sort of more of a well-off person who can be comforted or buffered by having better levels of income.
The stereotype would say that different generations of these families have a similar mindset, a similar outlook, which of course is not how families generally work. What did you find about that with these families?
I think we find across our families that people wanted to work. So that's probably the key finding, and the finding that we've come across in all of our research projects over many years, that people want to work. They often faced many challenges in being able to achieve those goals. I think what was interesting in this particular project was between the generations, people wanted things to be better. So parents wanted things to be better for their children, and children wanted things to be better than they had been for their parents. So children could recognise, young people recognised that there were difficulties for their parents. They'd seen it, they'd grown up with it, so they wanted their lives to be different.
And finally, what are the implications of all of this for how we make public policy?
Well, the first implication is we need to define what we think the problem is properly. So if we're talking about, inverted commas, cultures of worklessness or 3 generations of families that have never worked, we need to clearly recognise that actually some of this is a bit of a myth. As Tracy has stressed, across these studies and across all sorts of research, you'll find that the predominant view is that people really want to have jobs, and living on benefits is really no sort of life for anybody. So if the focus is about worklessness, we need to forget some of these ideas about cultures of worklessness and welfare dependency and really concentrate on what the issue is, which is about the lack of decent opportunities for people. So it's not just about there being not enough jobs, it's about the quality of employment that we need to provide people so that they can move out of poverty in the longer term.